Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to kick off today's presentation. Today, we're exploring the making of global world. We'll be looking at how our world has become interconnected, the key factors behind this transformation, and what it means for us all. So, let's dive in and discover the story behind our increasingly globalized world. Let's now turn our attention to the rise of mass production and consumption. This was a transformative period where advancements in manufacturing processes, especially the introduction of machinery, allowed goods to be produced on a much larger scale and at lower costs. As a result, more people could afford to buy these goods, leading to a significant increase in consumption. This shift not only changed industries, but also altered everyday life, making products more accessible and shaping consumer culture. This era's innovations laid the groundwork for a global economy driven by mass production. It connected to other developments we'll discuss, such as technological roles and transportation systems, which further facilitated the spread of goods and ideas across nations. The rise of mass production and consumption was truly a key driver of modern economic and social change, setting the stage for the interconnected world we see today. Globalization refers to an economic system that has really taken shape over the last 50 years, but its roots go way deeper. If we look back in history, from ancient times, people like travelers, traders, priests, and pilgrims have been venturing across vast distances. They did this for many reasons, seeking knowledge, new opportunities, spiritual fulfillment, or even escaping persecution. These journeys weren't just for personal growth. They also involved the exchange of goods, money, values, skills, ideas, and inventions. Sometimes, even germs and diseases traveled along these routes, which had significant impacts. For example, as early as 3000 BCE, there was active coastal trade connecting the Indus Valley civilizations to what we now call West Asia. This shows how interconnected ancient societies already were. And long before modern globalization, seashells called cowries from the Maldives were making their way to China and East Africa for over 1,000 years, serving as currency or decorative items. It's also important to recognize that the spread of diseases through these routes can be traced back to at least the 17th century, highlighting how interconnected societies have always been, both in beneficial exchanges and in challenges like disease transmission. All of these points demonstrate how long-distance interactions have shaped human history, setting the stage for the modern global economy we're discussing today. Trade and cultural exchange have always gone hand in hand throughout history. Early Christian missionaries, for example, traveled along these routes to reach Asia, just as early Muslim preachers did a few centuries later. But even before these religious missions, Buddhism emerged from eastern India and spread in multiple directions through the Silk Routes. The Silk Routes are essentially vibrant links of trade and culture connecting distant parts of the world. The name, Silk Routes, highlights the importance of Chinese silk, especially those westbound cargoes that traveled along these routes. Historians have identified several different silk routes, both over land and by sea, that connected vast regions of Asia and linked Asia with Europe and northern Africa. These routes have been in existence since before the Christian era and thrived until around the 15th century. But it wasn't just silk that traveled these routes. Chinese pottery, textiles, and spices from India and Southeast Asia also moved along these pathways. And in exchange, Europe received precious metals like gold and silver from Asia, creating a truly interconnected world. So the Silk Routes weren't just about trade, they were also about cultural exchange, spreading ideas, religions, and goods across continents. They played a crucial role in shaping the interconnected world we're exploring in this presentation. So, as we travel through history, we see that traders and travelers played a huge role in introducing new crops to different lands. Even foods that are considered ready to eat or processed in distant parts of the world often share common origins. For example, it's believed that noodles traveled west from China and eventually evolved into what we now call spaghetti. Similarly, Arabs are thought to have brought pasta to Sicily as early as the 5th century. Many of the foods we consider everyday staples today, like potatoes, soy, ground nuts, maize, tomatoes, chilies, and sweet potatoes were completely unknown to our ancestors until about 5 centuries ago. These foods only made their way into Europe and Asia after Christopher Columbus's accidental discovery of the Americas, a moment that truly changed global cuisine forever. So, in essence, this slide highlights how food has traveled and transformed across continents, linking different cultures through shared ingredients and culinary traditions. It's a fascinating reminder of how interconnected our food history really is. So, here we see how the humble potato played a crucial role in improving the diets and longevity of many Europeans, especially in poorer regions. In Ireland, in particular, the potato became a staple food for the poorest peasants, providing a reliable and affordable source of nutrition. However, this dependence had tragic consequences. When a disease struck and destroyed the potato crop in the mid-1840s, it led to a devastating famine. Hundreds of thousands of people died from starvation and related illnesses during this period. This tragic event is known as the Irish potato famine, and it highlights how reliance on a single crop can have catastrophic effects when that crop fails. It also underscores the broader theme of how technological and agricultural changes can both uplift and threaten societies, depending on their resilience and diversity. Now, moving on to slide 7, let's explore how conquest, disease, and trade shaped this transformative period. As Europeans expanded their reach, they brought with them not only new goods and ideas, but also devastating diseases that had profound impacts on populations across the world. These diseases, such as smallpox and measles, spread rapidly and often decimated indigenous communities who had no prior exposure or immunity. At the same time, conquest often involved the forced reshaping of societies, leading to new power dynamics and cultural exchanges. Trade, of course, was at the heart of these interactions. It facilitated the exchange of goods, knowledge, and even people. The influx of new commodities and ideas helped expand global networks, but also created disruptions and challenges. Overall, this period saw a complex interplay of conquest, disease, and trade that dramatically altered societies and set the stage for the interconnected world we recognize today. Starting from the 16th century, we see how America's vast lands, rich in crops and minerals, began to have a huge impact on trade and daily life around the world. These resources, especially the precious metals like silver from mines in what we now call Peru and Mexico, significantly boosted Europe's wealth. This influx of silver helped finance European trade with Asia, fueling economic growth and expanding global connections. At the same time, stories about South America's legendary wealth became popular in 17th century Europe. Tales of cities filled with gold, like El Dorado, sparked the imaginations of explorers and adventurers. Many expeditions were launched in search of this mythical city, driven by the hope of discovering unimaginable riches. All of this ties into the broader theme of how the discovery of America reshaped the world's economy, culture, and exploration, setting the stage for the modern interconnected world we know today. By the mid-16th century, the Portuguese and Spanish were well on their way to conquering and colonizing large parts of America. But what's truly fascinating is that their most powerful weapon wasn't a sword or a gun. It was actually tiny, invisible microbes. Specifically, the germs of smallpox. These germs were carried by the conquistadors, and because America's original inhabitants had been isolated for so long, they had no immunity against these European diseases. Smallpox, in particular, turned out to be a devastating killer. It spread rapidly across the continent, even before any Europeans set foot there. The disease wiped out entire communities, decimating populations and essentially clearing the way for conquest. This highlights how biological factors, like the spread of deadly germs, played a crucial role in the process of colonization, almost like a form of biological warfare. It's a stark reminder of how disease can be as destructive as any weapon in shaping history. Until the 19th century, poverty and hunger were widespread across Europe. Cities were often overcrowded, which made living conditions harsh and unhygienic, leading to the frequent spread of deadly diseases. Religious conflicts were also common during this period, and those who dissented from the dominant religious beliefs often faced persecution. These hardships caused many Europeans to flee their homeland in search of better opportunities. Many of these emigrants headed to America, where by the 18th century, plantations operated by enslaved Africans were expanding. These plantations produced cotton and sugar, which were highly valued commodities in European markets. This period highlights how social and economic struggles in Europe, combined with the brutal realities of slavery and plantation economies in the New World, shaped the course of history and migration patterns. It's a key part of understanding the broader themes of migration, economic development, and the social conflicts that define this era. All three flows, capital, labor, and trade, were closely interconnected during the 19th century, and they impacted people's lives more deeply than ever before. These flows didn't just happen in isolation, they shaped societies and economies across the world. For example, the flow of capital involved investments over long distances, supporting short-term or long-term projects. The flow of labor was about people migrating in search of employment opportunities, often crossing borders. And then there's the flow of trade, which involved the exchange of goods like cloth or wheat, connecting producers and consumers across continents. These interconnected flows transformed the world dramatically during this period, influencing economic, political, social, cultural, and technological changes in complex ways. So, understanding these flows helps us see how the 19th century was a time of profound global transformation. A good starting point to understand the broader economic changes is to look at how food production and consumption patterns evolved in industrial Europe. Traditionally, many countries aimed for self-sufficiency in food, believing that being able to produce all their food domestically was essential for stability. However, in 19th century Britain, this idea of self-sufficiency actually meant lower living standards and often led to social conflicts. As the population grew rapidly from the late 18th century, the demand for food increased significantly. At the same time, industrial growth meant that industries needed more agricultural products. Think of the raw materials for textiles, for example, and this drove up food grain prices. Now, under pressure from landowning groups, the government responded by restricting imports of corn, which was a major staple. These laws were known as the Corn Laws, and they aimed to keep grain prices high to protect domestic farmers. But this policy had its downsides. Industrialists and urban workers were unhappy because high food prices increased living costs and squeezed their budgets. As a result, they pushed hard for change, and eventually, the government was forced to abolish the Corn Laws. This shift reflects a crucial moment in the development of a more integrated world economy, where free trade began to play a bigger role in shaping economic and social policies. After the Corn Laws were abolished, we saw a significant shift in Britain's food supply. Food could now be imported more cheaply than it could be produced domestically. This change meant that large areas of land in Britain were left uncultivated, and as a result, thousands of men and women lost their jobs. Many of them moved to the cities in search of work, or they migrated overseas in hopes of better opportunities. As food prices dropped, more people in Britain could afford to buy and consume more food. This increased demand helped fuel economic growth. Starting from the mid-19th century, Britain's rapid industrial expansion also meant that incomes were rising, which further boosted food imports. But it wasn't just Britain benefiting from this change. Around the world, in Eastern Europe, Russia, America, and Australia, lands were being cleared and cultivated to meet Britain's growing demand for food. This period marks a pivotal moment where global agriculture expanded to support Britain's industrial and economic growth. So, as we can see, railways played a crucial role in connecting agricultural regions to the ports. This infrastructure was essential for transporting the produce efficiently to marketplaces and ships. To support this, new harbors needed to be built, and existing ones expanded to handle the increased cargo volume. At the same time, people had to settle on these lands to bring them under cultivation. This meant constructing homes and establishing settlements, which required significant amounts of capital and labor. The capital often came from financial centers like London, fueling these large-scale projects. This period also saw a massive wave of migration. Nearly 50 million people emigrated from Europe to America and Australia during the 19th century. Overall, it's estimated that around 150 million individuals left their homelands across the world, crossing oceans and vast land distances in search of a better future. All these activities, building railways, expanding ports, settling new lands, highlight how crucial an efficient transportation system was for economic growth and migration during this time. It truly interconnected economies, societies, and peoples across continents. In 1890, the global agricultural economy really began to take shape, and with it came some complex changes across various areas. Labor movement patterns, capital flows, ecologies, and technology all evolved significantly during this time. One of the most striking shifts was how food sources changed. No longer did people rely on nearby villages or towns for their food. Instead, it was coming from thousands of miles away. This meant that food production was no longer just about small-scale, local farming. Instead, it involved large farms worked by agricultural workers, many of whom had recently arrived from other regions. These workers were often employed on farms that, just a generation earlier, had been forests. So, we're seeing a transformation from natural landscapes into intensive agricultural operations. Transportation played a huge role in this shift too. Railways, built specifically to facilitate the movement of goods, enabled food to be transported over long distances efficiently. Ships also became increasingly important, and during this period, many of their crews were low-paid workers from southern Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. All of these interconnected changes highlight how globalized agriculture was becoming. Food production and distribution were no longer confined to local or regional scales, but were now part of a complex international system. This evolution set the stage for the larger economic and social shifts we see in the 20th century, tying into the broader theme of how globalization has continuously reshaped our world. The British Indian government undertook some significant and dramatic changes in West Punjab. One of the most notable efforts was the construction of a network of irrigation canals. These canals transformed what was once semi-desert wasteland into fertile agricultural lands. The goal was to enable the region to grow crops like wheat and cotton, which could then be exported to generate revenue. The areas irrigated by these new canals came to be known as the canal colonies. These colonies were settled by peasants migrating from other parts of Punjab, helping to populate and develop these new agricultural zones. This expansion of cotton cultivation, in particular, had a global impact. It boosted the supply of cotton to feed the British textile mills, which were a major part of Britain's industrial economy. It's also important to note that nearly 60% of this trade consisted of primary products, meaning raw agricultural products like wheat and cotton, as well as minerals such as coal. So, these canal colonies played a crucial role in transforming Punjab into a key agricultural hub, supporting Britain's export economy and industrial needs, which ties into the larger theme of how colonial policies reshaped regional economies to serve imperial interests. The railways, steamships, and the telegraph were truly groundbreaking inventions that changed the world during the 19th century. But it's important to remember that these technological advances didn't happen in a vacuum. They were often driven by larger social, political, and economic factors. For instance, colonization played a big role by stimulating new investments and pushing for improvements in transportation. Faster railways, lighter wagons, and larger ships made it possible to move food more cheaply and quickly from distant farms to markets. This interconnected development shows how technology and society influence each other, helping to create a more integrated and efficient world. Until the 1870s, animals were shipped live from America to Europe, and then they were slaughtered upon arrival. This method took up a lot of space on ships, and unfortunately, many animals didn't survive the journey. Some fell ill or became unfit to eat by the time they reached Europe. Because of this, meat was quite an expensive luxury, affordable only to the wealthy. For the European poor, this kept meat prices high, limiting access and keeping demand and production low. But then, a game-changing technology was developed: refrigerated ships. These ships allowed perishable foods, like meat, to be transported over long distances while still fresh. As a result, animals could be slaughtered in America, Australia, or New Zealand, then frozen and shipped to Europe. This innovation significantly cut shipping costs and lowered meat prices in Europe. Now, even the poor could enjoy a more varied diet. This improved living condition contributed to social stability within countries and also supported imperialism abroad, as nations expanded their influence and markets. Trade flourished and markets expanded in the late 19th century, marking a time of significant economic growth and increased interconnectedness around the world. However, it's important to recognize that this period wasn't solely about prosperity. There was a darker side to this story. In many parts of the world, the expansion of trade and the deepening ties to the global economy also meant the loss of freedoms and livelihoods for local populations. As European powers expanded their conquests during the late 19th century, they brought about profound economic, social, and ecological changes. These changes often disrupted traditional ways of life and integrated colonized societies into the global economy, but not without significant costs. So, while the period was one of growth and opportunity on one hand, it also involved considerable suffering and transformation for many societies on the other. In Africa during the 1890s, a devastating disease known as rinderpest, or cattle plague, was spreading rapidly across the continent. This disease had a terrifying impact on people's livelihoods and the local economy. When rinderpest struck, it didn't just affect animals. It reshaped the lives and fortunes of thousands of people and altered their relationships with the rest of the world. Historically, Africa had abundant land and a relatively small population, which meant that most people depended heavily on land and livestock for their survival. For centuries, these resources sustained African livelihoods, and many people rarely worked for wages. Instead, they relied on their land and animals for everything they needed. However, in the late 19th century, European powers were increasingly attracted to Africa's vast resources, land and minerals. They came with the hope of establishing plantations and mines, aiming to produce crops and minerals that could be exported back to Europe. This period marked a significant shift, as European interests began to influence the social and economic fabric of the continent. So, in essence, the spread of rinderpest was not just a health crisis. It was a catalyst that contributed to profound economic and social changes in Africa during that time, setting the stage for the colonial transformations that would follow. So, there was an unexpected problem that arose: a shortage of labor willing to work for wages. This was a significant issue because the economy relied heavily on labor-intensive industries like plantations and mines. To address this, employers used various methods to recruit and retain workers, but it wasn't easy. Heavy taxes were imposed, and these taxes could only be paid by working for wages, which was mostly on plantations and in mines. Additionally, inheritance laws were changed in a way that displaced peasants from their land. Now, only one member of a family could inherit land, which meant that the others had no choice but to enter the labor market to survive. And it wasn't just a matter of finding workers. Conditions were also restrictive. Mine workers, for example, were confined within compounds and weren't allowed to move freely, which made the labor shortage even more complicated. All of these factors created a complex challenge for the economy and for the social fabric of the time, highlighting the difficulties in maintaining a stable and willing workforce during this period. Rinderpest arrived in Africa in the late 1880s, marking the beginning of a devastating period for the continent. It was initially carried by infected cattle that were imported from British Asia, primarily to feed the Italian soldiers invading Eritrea in East Africa. This shows how colonial military movements contributed to the spread of disease across the region. Once it entered Africa in the east, rinderpest spread rapidly westward, almost like a forest fire, reaching the Atlantic coast by 1892. This rapid movement highlights how quickly the disease devastated large areas. 5 years later, it had reached Cape Town, Africa's southernmost tip, illustrating just how extensive its reach was. The impact was catastrophic. Up to 90% of the cattle population was killed along the way. This wasn't just about losing animals. It was about the destruction of livelihoods for countless African communities that depended on cattle for food, farming, and transportation. Furthermore, colonial powers recognized the strategic importance of cattle resources. They monopolized what remained, controlling access to these scarce resources to strengthen their power. This control allowed them to force Africans into the labor market, essentially using the cattle shortage as a tool of economic and political dominance. In essence, the arrival of rinderpest was a pivotal moment that facilitated the conquest and subjugation of Africa by European colonizers, demonstrating how disease and colonialism were intertwined in shaping the continent's history. On this slide, we see that the 19th century world was truly complex and multifaceted. It was a time of rapid economic growth, which brought many opportunities, but also significant suffering. While some people enjoyed higher incomes and improved living standards, others faced deep poverty and hardship. Technological advances transformed certain industries and regions, making production more efficient. However, at the same time, new forms of coercion and control emerged, especially in colonial contexts. A key aspect of this era was the movement of labor across the globe. Hundreds of Indian and Chinese workers migrated to work on plantations, mines, and large infrastructure projects like roads and railways in different parts of the world. These migrants often signed contracts, and in India, specifically, indentured laborers were hired under agreements that promised they could return to India after working for about 5 years on their employer's plantation. This system of indentured labor was a response to the labor shortages created by abolition and other economic shifts. It also highlights how migration was intertwined with global economic development, but it also raises questions about exploitation and the conditions faced by these workers. Overall, this reflects the broader theme of interconnectedness during the 19th century, how economic progress often came with social and human costs. The Indian indentured workers mainly came from regions that are now part of eastern Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, central India, and some dry districts of Tamil Nadu. During the mid-19th century, these areas went through significant changes. Cottage industries, which were small-scale local manufacturing, started to decline. At the same time, land rents increased, making it harder for poor farmers to keep their land. Lands were also cleared to make way for mines and plantations, which disrupted local communities. All of these changes had a big impact on the lives of ordinary people. Many couldn't pay their rents, leading to mounting debts. As a result, a lot of them were forced to migrate in search of work elsewhere. This is how the indentured migration began on a large scale. The indentured migrants were sent to various parts of the world, mainly the Caribbean islands like Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname, as well as Mauritius and Fiji. Tamil migrants, in particular, moved to Ceylon and Malaya. Additionally, indentured workers were recruited for tea plantations in Assam. So, in essence, these migrations were driven by economic hardships caused by regional changes, and they played a key role in shaping the Indian diaspora across the globe. Recruitment was carried out by agents who received a small commission for each migrant they recruited. Many of these migrants agreed to take up work because they saw it as a chance to escape poverty or oppression back in their home villages. However, it's important to understand that these agents often misled the prospective migrants by providing false information. They would lie about the final destinations, the modes of travel, the nature of the work, and the living and working conditions awaiting them. Sometimes, migrants weren't even told that they would have to undertake a long sea voyage. In some cases, agents went as far as forcibly abducting those who were less willing to go. This system has been described as a new system of slavery because, despite the formal differences, the living and working conditions were extremely harsh, and migrants had very few legal rights or protections. This highlights how, in many ways, the exploitative practices of the 19th century indenture system resembled traditional slavery, making it a very dark chapter in history of migration. It's a powerful reminder of the exploitation faced by many during this period, which connects to the broader themes of inequality and human rights we're exploring in this presentation. In Trinidad, the Muharram procession, which is a significant religious event, was transformed into a lively and colorful carnival called ICSE, named in honor of Imam Hussein. This event wasn't just about religious expression. It became a communal celebration where workers of all races and religions came together to participate. It really highlights how cultural practices can evolve and blend over time. Now, moving to Rastafarianism, which gained global recognition through the music of Bob Marley. It's often seen as a protest religion, but it also reflects deep social and cultural connections with Indian migrants in the Caribbean. This shows how religious identity can serve as a form of social expression and solidarity across different communities. And then there's chutney music, popular in Trinidad and Guyana. It's a vibrant, contemporary musical style that expresses the post-indentured experience, basically, the cultural journey of Indian migrants and their descendants. All of these examples, ICSE, Rastafarianism, chutney music, are part of a larger story of cultural fusion. They demonstrate how different traditions from around the world come together, often losing their original forms in the process, and then creating something entirely new. This process of mixing and transforming is a key part of how our global world is constantly evolving. Most indentured workers, after their contracts ended, often chose to stay on in their new homes or return to India after a short stay. In the early 1900s, Indian nationalist leaders began to oppose the system of indentured labor, viewing it as abusive and cruel. Their opposition grew as awareness of the harsh conditions spread. As a result of these efforts and changing attitudes, the system was eventually abolished in 1921. This marked a significant turning point in the history of labor migration and reflected a broader movement toward human rights and fair treatment. It's important to see this as part of the larger struggle for independence and social justice in India and the colonies. Growing crops for the global market required significant capital investment. Large plantations often needed to borrow money from banks and financial markets to fund their operations. Indian bankers like the Shikaripuri Shroffs and Nadukatai Chetshires played a crucial role here. They financed export agriculture not only in Central and Southeast Asia, but did so using their own funds or sometimes borrowing from European banks. They developed sophisticated systems for transferring money over long distances, which was essential for managing these large-scale transactions. Interestingly, they even created their own forms of corporate organization to facilitate their business activities. Now, Indian traders didn't limit themselves to Asia. They followed European colonizers into Africa, expanding their reach. And Hyderabadi Sindhi traders took a slightly different route. They ventured beyond European colonies and established thriving emporia at busy ports around the world from the 1860s onwards. These emporia became bustling centers where they sold local curios to the increasing number of tourists. All of these activities highlight the entrepreneurial spirit of Indian traders and their vital role in the global economy. Their ability to finance, organize, and expand their businesses across continents exemplifies how Indian entrepreneurs contributed to global trade networks during this period. Historically, Indian fine cottons were primarily exported to Europe, which shows how integral India was to the global cotton trade. However, with the onset of industrialization in Britain, things started to change. British cotton manufacturing expanded rapidly, and this growth prompted industrialists to push the government for protection. They wanted to restrict cotton imports to shield their emerging industries. As a result, tariffs were imposed on cloth imports into Britain, making it more difficult for Indian cotton to enter the British market. This led to a decline in the flow of fine Indian cotton, which was once so prominent. Meanwhile, British manufacturers, facing restrictions at home, began to look for new markets overseas to sell their textiles. But Indian textiles, which had previously enjoyed a strong position, now faced stiff competition in these international markets because of the tariffs and the expanding British industry. You can see the impact clearly in the numbers. Around 1800, Indian cotton textiles accounted for about 30% of the global market share, but by 1815, that had fallen to 15%. And by the 1870s, it was below 3%. This dramatic decline highlights how protective policies and industrial growth in Britain significantly affected Indian exports, reshaping the global cotton trade landscape and marking a turning point in India's trade history. Let's take a closer look at the opium trade during this period. The shipments of opium to China grew rapidly starting in the 1820s, so much so that at one point, India's single largest export became opium. This was a significant development, as Britain was cultivating opium in India and then exporting it to China. The profits from these sales were immense, and interestingly, the money earned was used to finance Britain's imports from China, like tea and other goods. Now, while Britain was earning a lot from these exports, it was also flooding the Indian market with British-manufactured goods, including food grains and raw materials. This created a situation where the value of British exports to India was much higher than what Britain was importing from India. This imbalance meant Britain had a trade surplus with India. And this surplus was crucial because Britain could use it to offset trade deficits with other countries around the world. It's a key example of how imperial trade networks operated to benefit Britain's economy during this period, and it connects to the larger theme of economic imperialism and global trade dynamics. The First World War, which took place from 1914 to 1918, was primarily fought in Europe, but its effects went far beyond the battlefield. Its impact plunged the entire world into a crisis that lasted for over 30 years, shaping the course of the 20th century. During this period, we see widespread economic and political instability, leading to significant upheavals and ultimately another devastating war. The war itself was fought between two main groups: the Allies, which included Britain, France, and Russia, and later the United States, and the Central Powers, consisting of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Ottoman Turkey. When the war started in August 1914, many governments believed it would be a quick conflict, expecting it to be over by Christmas. But as we all know, it actually lasted more than 4 years, with devastating consequences for everyone involved. The fighting in this war involved the world's leading industrial nations, which now had access to the immense powers of modern industry. This allowed them to inflict unprecedented levels of destruction on their enemies. We saw the widespread use of advanced weapons like machine guns, tanks, aircraft, and chemical weapons, all produced on a massive scale. These innovations were direct products of modern industry, showcasing how technological progress transformed warfare. To sustain the war effort, millions of soldiers had to be recruited from all around the world and transported to the front lines. They traveled on large ships and trains, emphasizing the global scale of the conflict. The result of this industrialized warfare was staggering, an unimaginable scale of death and destruction, with about 9 million lives lost and 20 million injured. Such devastation was almost impossible to conceive before the age of industry, highlighting how industrial arms changed the very nature of war itself. The death of many men during the war significantly reduced the able-bodied workforce across Europe. As a result, industries had to be restructured to focus on producing war-related goods, which changed the economic landscape quite dramatically. Society itself was also reorganized. Since men went off to battle, women stepped into roles that had traditionally been held by men, taking on jobs in factories and other industries. The war didn't just reshape industries and societies, it also had major geopolitical impacts. It led to the snapping of economic links between some of the world's largest economies. For example, Britain, which had been a major creditor, ended up borrowing large sums of money from U.S. banks and even from the U.S. public. This shift was so significant that it transformed the U.S. from an international debtor to an international creditor. By the end of the war, the U.S. and its citizens owned more overseas assets than foreign governments and citizens owned within the U.S. So, in many ways, the war shifted economic power towards the U.S., setting the stage for its rise as a global economic leader. Post-war economic recovery proved to be quite challenging, and Britain, which had been the world's leading economy before the war, faced a particularly prolonged crisis. While the war was ongoing, industries in India and Japan had developed significantly, which changed the global economic landscape. After the war, Britain struggled to regain its former dominance in the Indian market and also found it difficult to compete with Japan on the international stage. Additionally, to finance the massive expenses of the war, Britain borrowed heavily from the United States. This borrowing left Britain with enormous external debts once the war ended. So, in summary, the combination of emerging competitors and financial burdens made the post-war recovery a complex and difficult process for Britain. This situation highlights how global shifts and economic pressures can reshape a nation's standing after a major conflict. The war had led to an economic boom, which means there was a significant increase in demand for goods, higher levels of production, and more jobs being created. This period of growth was directly linked to the war effort, as industries expanded to meet wartime needs. However, once the war ended, this boom came to a halt. Production started to contract, and unfortunately, unemployment began to rise again. At the same time, the government took steps to reduce the enormous war expenditures, which had been necessary during the conflict. They aimed to bring these expenses in line with peacetime revenues, which meant cutting back on government spending. These changes, less demand, lower production, and reduced government spending, led to huge job losses. In fact, by 1921, about 1 in every 5 British workers was out of work. This high level of unemployment created a sense of anxiety and uncertainty that would become a lasting feature of the post-war period. So, what we see here is that the economic growth during the war was temporary, and the end of the war brought significant economic challenges that affected many people's lives. Many agricultural economies were also facing serious challenges during this period. Before the war, Eastern Europe was actually a major supplier of wheat to the global market, playing a crucial role in world food supplies. However, when the war disrupted this supply, countries like Canada, the United States, and Australia stepped in to fill the gap, and their wheat production expanded dramatically. But here, where it gets interesting, once the war ended and Eastern Europe's agriculture recovered, it led to a surplus of wheat, what we call a glut, because all these different sources were producing more than the market could absorb. This excess supply caused grain prices to plummet, which meant farmers' incomes declined significantly. And as their incomes fell, farmers found themselves sinking deeper into debt, making the agricultural crisis even more severe. This situation underscores how interconnected global markets are, and how shifts in supply and demand can have widespread economic impacts, especially on rural communities. It's a key part of understanding the broader economic instability during this time. The U.S. economy resumed its strong growth in the early 1920s, marking a period of rapid expansion and prosperity. A key factor behind this boom was the rise of mass production, which fundamentally transformed how goods were made. This shift actually began back in the late 19th century, laying the groundwork for what would become a manufacturing revolution. One of the most influential pioneers of this movement was Henry Ford. He didn't invent mass production, but he perfected it and made it practical for large-scale manufacturing. Ford adapted an innovative technique called the assembly line, which was originally used in a Chicago slaughterhouse. In that setting, butchers would pick animals off a conveyor as they came down, streamlining the butchering process. Ford applied this concept to car manufacturing, drastically reducing the time and cost to produce each vehicle. This not only made cars more affordable, but also spurred widespread consumption, changing American society forever. So, the rise of mass production and mass consumption became a key driver of the economic growth that defined the 1920s, shaping the modern economy we know today.